Today, we're ranking every major anti-aircraft gun of World War II, from the guns so unreliable their own crews had better luck throwing wrenches at the sky, to the weapons so effective it turned the air itself into a killing field.
Rank 14. Type 96 25mm AT/AA gun, Japan. It's 1944, on a Pacific island nobody back home can pronounce, and a Japanese gun crew is watching an American dive bomber commit to its run. The gunner's already fighting the mount before he's fired a shot. The Type 96's traverse and elevation are hand-cranked, too slow to keep pace with anything moving fast, and by the time he's tracking the target, it's already released and gone. Then, the magazine runs dry after 15 rounds, because someone designed a light AA gun around a box magazine barely bigger than a rifle's, reloading under fire, hands shaking, watching the sky. The Type 96 wasn't just outdated, it was mismatched to the war it was fighting. Japan built thousands of them and pushed them into everything from island garrisons to ship decks, but production quality collapsed as the war dragged on, and individual magazines frequently weren't interchangeable between guns of the same model, meaning a jammed magazine couldn't always be swapped for a spare from the gun next to it. Against the wave of American carrier aircraft in 1944 and 45, this was a gun built for a slower war, defending against an enemy that had already moved past it.
Rank 13. QF 2-pounder, Pom-pom, United Kingdom. The Royal Navy loved the sound of the pom-pom before they trusted the mechanism. Named for the stuttering rhythm of its firing cycle, the 2-pounder was meant to be Britain's answer to close-range naval air defense in the 1920s and 30s, and by the time war broke out, it was already showing its age. Low muzzle velocity meant it struggled against faster monoplane fighters. Fabric ammunition belts jammed in salt air. Crews on destroyers and cruisers learned to nurse the thing through a firefight rather than trust it. Here's what actually saved the pom-pom's reputation: quantity and desperation. Fitted in multi-barrel mountings, the famous Chicago piano octopus mounts, enough of them firing together could still put up a wall of fire that mattered during the worst years of the war, particularly around Malta and in the Mediterranean convoys. It wasn't a good gun. It was a gun that British sailors had no choice but to make work, and for a while, that was enough.
Rank 12. DShK, 12.7mm, Soviet Union. Contrast this with the pom-pom's fussiness. The DShK was built to survive the Eastern Front, and it did. Officially, a heavy machine gun rather than a purpose-built AA cannon, the DShK ended up doing anti-aircraft work almost by necessity, mounted on trucks, tripods, and tank turrets, wherever a Soviet unit needed something pointed skyward on short notice. It had no illusions about reaching high-altitude bombers. This was a low-level, close-in weapon, effective against strafing aircraft and observation planes, but essentially useless past a few thousand feet. What it had instead was reliability, that Soviet industry could actually mass-produce under wartime conditions, and a simple gas-operated action that kept firing in mud, cold, and neglect that would have stopped more delicate designs cold. It's not remembered as a glamorous anti-aircraft weapon. It's remembered because it was everywhere and it worked when it needed to.
Rank 11. Browning M2.50 caliber, United States. Here's a number that surprises people. American forces mounted more M250 calibers in anti-aircraft roles during the war than any dedicated AA cannon they built. On tanks, half-tracks, ship rails, and improvised mounts, the Ma Deuce became the default answer whenever an American unit needed to put lead into the sky fast, without waiting for a proper AA battery to show up. The myth is that this made it a genuinely effective anti-aircraft weapon. The reality is closer to a stopgap that worked because there were so many of them. The M2's effective altitude ceiling was low. Its single rounds rarely brought down anything but the lightest aircraft outright, and it depended on sheer volume of fire. Quad-mounted M2 systems on half-tracks were far more useful than single guns for exactly this reason. What made it valuable wasn't lethality per shot. It was that a 50 cal was already sitting on nearly every American vehicle, ready to fire the moment a plane came in low.
Rank 10. 2cm Flak 30 and Flak 38, Germany. Germany's light anti-aircraft problems started with a gun that was, frankly, too slow. The original Flak 30 fired around 280 rounds per minute, respectable on paper, inadequate against aircraft closing at several hundred miles an hour. The Flak 38 that replaced it nearly doubled the rate of fire, and quad-mounted flak-fearling versions turned 4 of these guns into a single weapon capable of putting up a genuinely dangerous curtain of fire at low altitude. The irony is that Germany needed this gun most on the ground, not in the air. As Allied fighter bombers began hunting German columns and rail lines late in the war, Flak 38 crews found themselves fighting a ground war as much as an air war. The same guns that were supposed to protect marching infantry from strafing runs became some of the most feared weapons in Normandy's hedgerows when depressed and fired horizontally into advancing troops. A light AA gun that ended up just as useful as an anti-personnel weapon says something about how desperate that final year became.
Rank 9, Oerlikon 20mm, Allied Navy's Switzerland designed. Ask an Axis pilot what the Allied fleet actually thought of him, and the honest answer by 1943 was, not much once he got within Oerlikon range. Originally Swiss-designed and produced under license across Britain and the United States, 20mm Oerlikon became the standard close-in defense weapon on Allied warships of every size, from battleships down to landing craft. It was reliable, relatively simple to maintain at sea, and forgiving enough that a crew with minimal training could keep it firing through a battle. What it wasn't, by the war's later years, was fast or hard-hitting enough to reliably stop the threat that mattered most in the Pacific: kamikaze aircraft that could absorb Oerlikon hits and still complete their dive. The Navy knew it and began supplementing and eventually replacing Oerlikon mounts with heavier 40mm guns as the suicide attack threat grew. A gun that was exactly right for 1942 became visibly outmatched by 1945, not because it got worse, but because the war did. Rank 8, 37mm Automatic Air Defense Gun M1939, 61K, Soviet Union. Could a Soviet factory in 1939 build a genuinely modern light AA gun from scratch? Not quite, and the 61K's early service showed it. Influenced by contemporary Bofors pattern designs, the 61K suffered reliability problems and slow initial production, exactly the kind of teething issues you'd expect from Soviet industry racing to modernize before a war it knew was coming. But the 61K got the thing that mattered most on the Eastern Front: time, and enough factories eventually turning them out in real numbers. By the middle of the war, it had become the backbone of Soviet divisional air defense, protecting columns and rail yards from the low-level strafing runs that plagued Red Army movements. It never had the reputation of the German 88 or the sophistication of Allied radar-directed systems. It had the unglamorous virtue of being available, in quantity, exactly when Soviet forces needed something, anything, pointed at the sky.
Rank 7, QF 4.5-inch naval gun, United Kingdom. Where the Pom-pom was fussy and specialized, the QF 4.5-inch was a workhorse doing two jobs at once. Fitted to British destroyers, cruisers, and capital ships as a dual-purpose weapon, it could engage surface targets and put high-explosive shells into the air against attacking aircraft. A compromise weapon, built for a navy that couldn't afford to carry a separate gun for every job. That compromise came with a real cost against fast air targets: slower rate of fire than a dedicated AA gun, and elevation and tracking systems designed as much for surface gunnery as for chasing aircraft across the sky. It did its job well enough in the roles it was actually built for, and the Royal Navy leaned on it heavily throughout the war precisely because a ship carrying 4.5-inch guns didn't need to sacrifice deck space to a second weapon system. Solid, unspectacular. Exactly what a stretched wartime Navy needed more of. Rank 6, 3.7cm Flak 18 36-37, Germany. Germany built the 3.7cm Flak family to bridge the gap between light 20mm guns and the heavy 88, and ended up with a weapon that never quite closed either gap satisfactorily. It hit harder than the 2cm series and could threaten aircraft the smaller guns couldn't touch. But its rate of fire and mobility lagged behind what the war increasingly demanded, especially once Allied fighter bombers began flying faster, lower, and in greater numbers over German-held territory. By the war's later years, the 3.7cm sat in an awkward middle position. Not quite obsolete, but consistently overshadowed by better light guns on the Allied side and by its own famous heavier sibling on the German side. It stayed in service throughout the war, mostly because Germany needed every AA barrel it could field, not because the gun itself had aged particularly well. Reliable, present in huge numbers, and permanently living in the shadow of a more famous relative. Rank 5, 90mm M1/M3, United States. Here's a spec that tells you everything. By the middle of the war, American 90mm AA batteries equipped with early proximity-fused shells were shooting down aircraft at ranges and altitudes that made German bomber crews start rethinking entire approach routes. Originally developed as a heavy anti-aircraft gun, the 90mm high velocity and strong ballistic performance made it good enough that the Army eventually adapted it for tank and tank destroyer use as well. A rare case of an AA gun proving so capable it got drafted into a completely different job. What made the 90mm dangerous wasn't just the gun, it was what got paired with it. Radar-directed fire control, and from 1943 onward, the proximity fuse, a shell that detonated automatically when it sensed it was near a target, rather than requiring a direct hit or a perfectly timed manual fuse. Against the V-1 flying bombs targeting London and southern England, 90mm and 5-inch batteries using proximity fuses achieved kill rates that stunned even the crews firing them. A heavy gun married to a genuinely new kind of ammunition.
Rank 4. QF 3.7-inch AA gun, United Kingdom. Picture a Royal Artillery crew outside London during the Blitz, night after night, cranking the 3.7-inch through the same drill under blackout conditions. Load, track, fire, repeat. Watching searchlights sweep for targets they mostly couldn't see. Britain's primary heavy anti-aircraft gun of the war, the 3.7-inch was roughly comparable to Germany's 88 in performance, with strong range and a respectable rate of fire for a gun its size. Where it fell short of true legend status wasn't the gun itself, it was how Britain used it. Unlike the 88, the 3.7-inch was rarely pressed into the dual anti-tank role that made its German counterpart so feared on the ground, staying largely dedicated to home and theater air defense throughout the war. That's not a flaw in the weapon, it's a difference in doctrine, and it meant the 3.7-inch built its reputation quietly, gun pit by gun pit, defending British cities rather than terrifying tank crews on a battlefield.
Rank 3. 85mm air defense gun M1939, 52K, Soviet Union. The Soviet Union entered the war needing a heavy AA gun that could match anything Germany fielded, and the 52K largely delivered. Good altitude performance, a respectable rate of fire, and, like its German rival, a second life as an anti-tank weapon once Soviet commanders realized what a high-velocity AA gun could do to armor at range. What the 52K didn't get, for most of the war, was the reputation it arguably deserved. Overshadowed internationally by the mythology built up around the German 88, the 52K quietly did comparable work defending Soviet cities, rail junctions, and, later in the war, knocking out German tanks when pressed into direct-fire anti-armor rules during major offensives. It's the underdog of this list, a genuinely capable heavy gun that history remembers mostly as the Soviet one, standing in the shadow of a more famous name on the other side of the front line. Rank 2. 5-inch 38 caliber, United States Navy. By 1944, kamikaze pilots training for their final missions were told, in effect, to fear one weapon above the rest of the American fleet's defenses, the 5-inch 38. Widely regarded as one of the best dual-purpose naval guns of the entire war, it combined a fast, reliable rate of fire with genuine surface gunnery power, and then got paired with the same proximity fuse technology that transformed the Army's 90mm into a war-winning weapon. The math here is almost unbelievable. Naval gunners using proximity-fused 5-inch shells against incoming aircraft saw their effective kill rate jump dramatically compared to older time-fused ammunition. A single shell no longer needed to score a near-perfect hit to bring a plane down, just to get close enough for the fuse to trigger. Against the kamikaze threat that terrified the Pacific Fleet in 1944 and 45, the 5-inch 38 wasn't just a good gun. It was, alongside radar and the proximity fuse together, one of the reasons the U.S. Navy survived that campaign, with the fleet largely intact. Rank 1. 8.8 centimeter Flak 18/36/37, the 88, Germany. Ask most people what the 88 was for, and they'll tell you it was a tank killer, the gun that shredded Allied armor from North Africa to Normandy. That reputation is real and well-earned. It's also not actually why the gun was built. The 88 started life purely as a high-altitude anti-aircraft gun, designed to reach bombers that lighter German AA simply couldn't touch, and it spent the entire war doing exactly that job in enormous numbers over German cities and the Eastern Front. The dual-purpose legend grew almost by accident. The 88's high velocity and flat trajectory, ideal for tracking fast aircraft, turned out to be exactly what you'd want in an anti-tank gun too. And German commanders in the Desert Campaign began pressing 88 batteries into direct fire roles against British armor out of pure battlefield improvisation. It worked so well the reputation eclipsed the gun's actual primary mission. By the war's end, the 88 had shot down thousands of Allied aircraft over the Reich, destroyed countless tanks it was never originally designed to fight, and become, across both roles combined, arguably the most feared single artillery piece of the entire war. Not because it did one job better than everything else on this list, because it did two jobs better than almost anything else built for either one.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below.